The long march west continued through the harsh winter of 1943.
Load the breach! Move! Firing position!
The world did not fall into war overnight. It drifted slowly, dangerously toward a storm everyone could sense, but no one dared name. The year was 1919, and the ink of peace was still wet on the Treaty of Versailles. Across Europe, cities still smoldered, the dead still unburied. Mothers pressed photographs to their hearts. Men limped home to countries that no longer felt like home. The Great War, they said, had ended all wars. But beneath the ruins, another conflict was already taking root. History, like the earth itself, hides its next eruption under layers of silence. The victors carved borders and debts into the bones of nations. Germany was forced to kneel, its pride shackled by reparations it could never repay. In the cafes of Munich, in the unemployment lines, in the hearts of the humiliated, a fever began to grow. A fever called resentment. Meanwhile, across oceans, the United States turned inward. Britain clung to its empire but felt the weight of exhaustion. France fortified its borders with concrete and hope. The world pretended that the future could be built on paper agreements and empty words. But history listens to whispers. From the shattered trenches of the Western Front rose a corporal whose voice promised revenge: Adolf Hitler. In beer halls and street corners, he told a broken people that they had not lost the last war they had been betrayed. He offered them a dream of purity, unity, destiny. The crowd listened. They always do, when someone promises to turn shame into glory. In Italy, Benito Mussolini wrapped himself in the banners of ancient Rome and promised order through fear. In Japan, the emperor's generals looked outward to islands and empires. The 1,930 seconds became a decade of tightening fists and darkening skies. And so, the stage was set. While jazz echoed through New York and London, danced beneath electric lights, the heart of Europe pulsed with drums of anger. In 1933, Hitler took power. In 1935, he rearmed in defiance of Versailles. In 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland as the world watched and did nothing. The League of Nations protested politely, then fell silent. Appeasement became the new diplomacy. Spain erupted in civil war. Guernica burned beneath German bombs, a rehearsal for the horrors to come. In the east, Japan invaded China, turning cities like Nanjing into slaughterhouses. The world was not blind. It was willfully blind. Each government hoped the storm would stop at its border. By 1938, the map trembled again. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich, waving a piece of paper that he called "Peace for Our Time." The crowd cheered, cameras flashed, but peace signed in fear is only the pause before thunder. Czechoslovakia was swallowed whole. Next came Poland. The 1st of September, 1939. Dawn broke over the Polish frontier. Farmers awoke to the sound of engines, 1,000 planes cutting through morning fog. Then came the first explosions. Villages vanished beneath fire and dust. Within hours, armored divisions, the new beasts called Panzer, roared across fields once plowed by hand. The Blitzkrieg had been born. Lightning war. Fast, ruthless, unstoppable. Within 2 days, Britain and France declared war. Their ambassadors stood in silence as words they had hoped never to speak filled the air once more. We are at war with Germany. Across the world, radios crackled with disbelief. In the streets of Warsaw, mothers clutched children under the scream of sirens. In London, men who had barely survived the last war tightened their fists again. In Berlin, crowds roared their approval, while searchlights pierced the night sky. Europe had fallen into its second suicide. As September bled into October, the Polish resistance fought with courage, but no hope. The Soviet Union, once Germany's enemy, struck from the east, slicing Poland in half under a secret pact known only to dictators. Refugees flooded westward, dragging memories instead of luggage. The war was only weeks old, and already millions were on the move. Winter came early that year. Snow fell on bombed ruins, muffling the screams of cities. In the calm that followed, Europe held its breath. The newspapers called it the phony war. Soldiers waited along the Maginot Line, a fortress stretching across France, while British troops played cards in damp trenches. Nothing happened. The world began to hope, foolishly, that perhaps the worst was over. But history, again, was waiting. To the north, another front flickered to life. In Finland, Soviet tanks rolled through frozen forests, expecting easy victory. Instead, they met white-clad ghosts, the Finnish ski troops who struck like shadows in the snow. It was a lesson. Courage can wound giants. But lessons rarely last long. By spring 1940, the quiet broke. On April 9th, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. The lightning returned ships slicing fjords, parachutes blooming over cities. Norway fell. Denmark surrendered in hours. Then, on May 10th, the true storm began. The Wehrmacht surged into Belgium and the Netherlands, bypassing France's mighty Maginot Line through the thick forests of the Ardennes, a route generals had dismissed as impossible. Steel poured through trees. French commanders stared at their maps in disbelief. Paris, the city of light, was doomed. At Dunkirk, nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers found themselves trapped between sea and enemy. Hitler's panzers closed in. The Channel lay calm, mocking. Then, in an act no strategist could predict, a nation rose. Fishermen, ferry captains, weekend sailors, ordinary men and women sailed across the waters in anything that could float. They brought their sons home. Operation Dynamo, a miracle of desperation. The beaches burned, but the army lived to fight again. A week later, France surrendered. The world gasped. Paris fell silent under the boots of occupation. The Eiffel Tower stood untouched, a trophy for conquerors. In London, Winston Churchill took the microphone and spoke to a frightened island. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." The words became armor. Now the war was no longer European, it was existential. The skies above Britain turned into battlefields. The Battle of Britain began. Hurricanes and Spitfires clawing at the heavens against the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. For the first time, Hitler's war machine met defiance it could not crush. Night after night, bombs fell over London. Entire neighborhoods vanished in firestorms. Families slept in underground stations, singing to keep fear at bay. Yet the city endured. The Blitz forged something unbreakable: unity. In Berlin, the Führer's map lines halted. For the first time he had been denied, and denial to such a man is poison. Winter 1940 turned to 1941. Across the Atlantic, the United States still watched from afar, divided between isolation and instinct. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent aid to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act. Weapons, ships, hope. Slowly, inevitably, America was being drawn toward the storm. But another empire was already plotting its own thunder across the Pacific. When the smoke over Dunkirk drifted out to sea, Europe felt hollowed out. Cities that once rang with church bells now echoed with the drone of German bombers. Across the Channel, Britain stood alone, an island fortress surrounded by darkened seas, its people bracing for invasion. The summer of 1940 was a season of flame and courage. Each dawn began with sirens. Each dusk ended with fire. London burned. Coventry crumbled. And yet the nation did not bow. Under vaulted sky, tracer fire stitched constellations of defiance. Pilots barely out of boyhood rose into the clouds in hurricanes and Spitfires, outnumbered, but never outspirited. They fought not for conquest, but for survival. For every downed aircraft, there was a new tale whispered in the shelters. We can endure anything. Beneath the rubble, the omniscient voice of history speaks softly. War is not only measured by territory gained, but by the refusal to yield what cannot be measured, the will of a people. Hitler, denied his victory in the air, turned his gaze eastward. In Berlin, maps unfurled like dark wings. The plan, to crush the Soviet Union in a single campaign, Operation Barbarossa. But before the East could burn, the Balkans had to bend. In April 1941, Yugoslavia was torn apart in 12 days. Greece, proud and mountainous, held for weeks, fighting in rain and ruin before falling beneath the swastika. Meanwhile, in the sands of North Africa, another theater was opening. Italy's ambitions faltered. Mussolini's troops, ill-prepared and overconfident, stumbled into disaster. To rescue them came Germany's desert fox, Erwin Rommel. His Africa corps moved like mirages across the dunes, engines roaring like storms. Tobruk, El Agheila, Benghazi, names that would haunt dispatches. War had become a dance of machines under a sun that melted both steel and mercy. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched and waited, neutral in law, but not in heart. Convoys threaded the Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, and hope. German U-boats hunted them beneath the waves, silent wolves marking their prey with periscopic eyes. For sailors, death came without warning, just a shudder through the hull and the sudden rush of icy blackness. By June 1941, the moment arrived. 3 million German soldiers gathered along an 1800-mile front. On June 22nd, at dawn, the horizon turned white with artillery flashes. The largest invasion in human history had begun, Barbarossa. It was not merely a campaign, it was an apocalypse unleashed upon the East. The fields of Ukraine, the forests of Belarus, the plains of Russia, all became corridors of fire. Villages vanished in smoke. Civilians were herded, executed, erased. Behind the front, the Einsatzgruppen followed, their task unspeakable, the systematic extermination of entire communities. The Holocaust had begun not in camps, but in open fields where silence replaced prayer. Moscow reeled. Lenin's mausoleum shook as bombs fell on the Kremlin spires. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and moved east beyond the Urals, reassembled in frozen wilderness. Women, children, and old men forged tanks beneath the northern lights. And winter, Russia's oldest general, prepared its ambush. Autumn 1941, Leningrad was encircled. 2.5 million souls trapped in a ring of iron. Bread rations fell to ounces. Glue was boiled for soup. Yet music persisted. The Leningrad Symphony, played amid bombardment, its notes defying starvation. The omniscient narrator whispers, even in despair, humanity composes its resistance. In December, snow buried the invaders. Engines froze, rifles jammed, men died standing. The Red Army counterattacked. Barbarossa stalled 50 miles from Moscow. Hitler's war of weeks had become a war of years. And then, across the Pacific, the storm widened. December 7th, 1941. Sunday morning in Hawaii. Sunlight glinted on calm waters as sailors prepared for routine. Then came the drones, the rising whine of engines, the shriek of sirens. Pearl Harbor erupted in fire and steel. Battleships capsized. Men leapt into burning oil. In less than 2 hours, the United States had been dragged from neutrality into destiny. Yesterday, said President Roosevelt, a date which will live in infamy. There is this plaque to the due. Now, the world was truly at war. Axis powers Germany, Italy, Japan, arrayed against an alliance still finding its shape. The Pacific became a chessboard of islands and blood. The Philippines fell. Singapore, the pride of empire, surrendered. Yet even as defeat spread, resolve hardened. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a vow: we will fight back. Factories in Detroit thundered day and night. Liberty ships slid from docks, bombers from assembly lines. Women took the places of men, riveting wings and forging shells. A new kind of army marched, one powered by industry. In North Africa, the Desert War shifted again. The British Eighth Army, under Montgomery, met Rommel at El Alamein. The air was thick with dust and prophecy. For the first time, the Afrika Korps broke. Churchill's words echoed through Parliament. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. As 1942 dawned, the world stood divided but awake. The Axis at its zenith, the Allies gathering strength. In the east, Stalingrad loomed. In the Pacific, carriers prepared to duel across endless blue. The war was now total: factories, families, and faith all conscripted. The age of blitzkrieg was giving way to the age of attrition. The omniscient voice falls silent for a moment. The planet spins beneath clouds of smoke. Every corner now knows the taste of fear. And still, humanity endures. By early 1942, the map of the world looked fevered, vast stretches painted in the colors of empire and conquest. The Axis seemed unstoppable, its banners planted from the snows of Russia to the jungles of Burma. Yet even empires that burn brightest cast the longest shadows. The war had now become planetary. The Atlantic, the Pacific, the deserts, the skies, each a different arena, each demanding new courage. From Moscow to Manila, from Cairo to Canberra, the earth itself had become a front line. The Eastern Inferno. On the Eastern Front, the furnace of Stalingrad was being built brick by brick. The Volga shimmered like molten glass as Soviet and German shells tore the city apart. Every block became a battlefield, every factory a fortress. "The enemy is at the gates," radioed the defenders, and the world held its breath. Through smoke and snow, the Red Army clung to rubble that had once been streets. Snipers hunted each other in silence. Civilians hauled ammunition through sewers. Men froze where they fell. But still they fought, driven not by orders but by the belief that beyond the river there was no more Russia to give. In Berlin, Hitler promised victory. In Moscow, Stalin ordered endurance. And so, across 6 months of terror, Stalingrad became the crucible in which the fate of the war would be forged. The Pacific awakens. Half a world away, another kind of fire burned. After Pearl Harbor, Japan's empire surged outward like a tide. Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, each fell beneath the rising Sunday. Prisoners marched through jungles and across bridges of death. Yet from the ruins of the Pacific Fleet rose new carriers and new resolve. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea turned back an invasion for the first time. A month later came Midway, a duel of aircraft and codebreakers. In 5 minutes of furious combat, 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The tide, invisible but real, began to shift. Across the islands, Marines learned to fight in heat and mud. Guadalcanal became a word whispered with dread and pride. Mosquitoes, rain, bayonets in the dark. Every coconut grove was contested. Every landing bought with blood. The desert and the mountains. In North Africa, the seesaw war raged. Rommel struck toward Egypt, dreaming of the Nile. Montgomery met him with patience and numbers. The Second Battle of El Alamein blazed for 12 nights. When the guns fell silent, the Axis was in retreat. The desert, once their hunting ground, became their graveyard. To the north, the mountains of Italy waited. Mussolini's dream of empire had turned to dust. The Allies landed in Sicily, then on the mainland. Rome trembled. Italy surrendered, and its former leader became a fugitive in his own land. German troops poured in to hold the peninsula, turning olive groves into killing fields. The hidden fronts, Beneath the headlines of tanks and bombers, invisible armies moved spies, saboteurs, resistance cells. In the forests of Poland, partisans derailed trains. In France, messages were smuggled inside loaves of bread. The radio became a weapon more potent than any rifle. "The night is dark," said the coded broadcasts, "but the dawn will come." Women carried secrets under their dresses. Children acted as couriers. Priests hid pilots in church towers. The omniscient voice murmurs, "Freedom often survives not by strength, but by stubbornness." Home fronts and total war. By 1943, war was no longer confined to soldiers. It lived in every household. In Britain, women welded ships. In America, ration books replaced wallets. In Germany, the word Heimatfront, home front, became as fearful as any battlefield. Bombers crossed continents nightly. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, names that would burn again and again. Firestorms rolled through streets, consuming oxygen itself. Civilians huddled in cellars as entire cities turned to ash. The war of machines had become a war of annihilation. The turning point. Back at Stalingrad, the turning came suddenly. In November 1942, under a frozen moon, Soviet armies encircled the Germans. What had been a siege became a trap. The Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, was reduced to starvation and surrender. On February 2, 1943, silence fell over the Volga. The once invincible Wehrmacht had been broken. In that silence, the world heard a new rhythm retreat. The Red Army pushed westward. The Allies advanced north from Africa. The noose was beginning to close. A world on fire. From the Arctic convoys braving U-boats to deliver supplies to Murmansk, to the jungles of Burma, where the Chindits marched through rain and fever, the war spanned every climate known to man. It was fought in ice and sand, in the sky and under the sea. The omniscient narrator's tone deepens. No generation before or since has carried so heavy a burden on so many shoulders. The seas foamed with shipwrecks. The skies rained metal. Yet amid the destruction, alliances were born. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union binding themselves by necessity. They did not trust one another, but they needed one another more than they feared. Tehran, 1943. The Big Three met for the first time. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. Around the same table sat hope and calculation. Plans were drawn for a second front in Europe, the day when liberation would come not from words, but from 1,000 ships crossing a hostile sea. Prelude to the storm. As 1943 gave way to 1944, victory still seemed distant. The Pacific Islands remained a maze of fire. China bled. The Eastern Front devoured men by the millions. But somewhere beneath the roar of engines and the cries of the lost, there was the faint pulse of inevitability. In hidden hangars of England, paratroopers drilled by moonlight. In Soviet factories, tanks rolled out faster than graves could be dug. The wind of history had shifted. The narrator's voice softens, almost reverent. The world had crossed a point of no return. No nation untouched, no life unscarred. And yet through exhaustion, through horror, the dream of ending tyranny had taken root. The fire that once consumed continents now began to light a path toward liberation. By 1944, the world was an engine of war. Every factory throbbed like a heartbeat. Every sunrise brought the rumble of trains hauling men and metal towards some distant horizon. Yet beneath that noise was a new rhythm, the slow, steady pulse of momentum shifting. The Eastern Avalanche. After Stalingrad came Kursk, a clash so vast that the earth itself seemed to convulse. Thousands of tanks met across the wheat fields of southern Russia, the air vibrating with their roar. In July 1943, the Red Army shattered the myth of German invincibility. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht would never again choose the battlefield. Village by village, field by field, the Soviets pressed westward, Smolensk, Kiev, Minsk, each name reclaimed in blood. In their wake lay a trail of horror revealed. Mass graves, burnt churches, silence where towns had been. The scale of the crime was becoming visible, and history itself recoiled. The long road home. Across Europe, resistance flared brighter. In the forests of Yugoslavia, partisans fought under red stars. In France, coded messages hummed through the night. The daisies bloom tomorrow. It meant only one thing: invasion was near. Britain had become an armed island, its southern ports alive with secrecy. 1,000,000 men gathered under camouflage nets. Engineers rehearsed miracles of logistics. Priests blessed ships in the fog. The code name was Overlord. The longest day, the 6th of June, 1944. Dawn broke over the gray waters of the English Channel. The largest armada in history moved toward France: 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 15,600 soldiers. The beaches had names that would live forever: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The first waves met walls of steel and fire. Bullets cut through surf. Men vanished into the tide. Yet by midday, the beachheads held. Behind them came the endless tide of liberation. France was no longer a map under occupation. It was a nation being reborn, one village at a time. Paris rose in August. Church bells rang for the first time in 4 years. Crowds flooded the boulevards as the tricolor unfurled from Notre Dame. 1,000 cameras captured a single emotion relief. The world had begun to believe again. The Pacific crucible. While Europe exhaled, the Pacific inhaled for its next storm. The American counteroffensive swept through the Central Pacific: Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Leyte. Each island was a miniature apocalypse. Marines clawed across coral sands under the hiss of mortars. Jungle leaves hid snipers and ghosts. At sea, carriers had replaced battleships as the masters of fate. Planes dueled over miles of empty ocean. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's veteran pilots perished in one terrible afternoon. Yet even as its navy bled away, Japan hardened its spirit. Kamikaze pilots strapped letters to their chests and took flight human bombs, fueled by despair. The war was turning, but not ending. The final acts of empire are always the most desperate. Total war, total sacrifice. Back home, the Allies waged another battle production. Liberty ships launched every 4 days. Bombers rolled off lines faster than they could be shot down. In the Soviet Union, women worked through blackouts. In America, African American and Native workers joined a new industrial army. The world had never seen such unity of effort, nor such exhaustion. Cities continued to burn. Hamburg, Berlin, Tokyo, each became infernos of firestorms. The narrator's voice lowers. When cities become targets, humanity bombards itself. Moral boundaries blurred with the smoke. The war was no longer about victory alone. It was about survival of civilization itself. The winter counter-blow. By late 1944, the Allies had crossed into Germany. Hitler, cornered yet delusional, ordered one last strike. In December, under blizzards and secrecy, his armies surged through the Ardennes. It was the Battle of the Bulge, a sudden swell in the front line, a desperate gamble to split the Allied forces. American troops in Bastogne found themselves encircled. When the Germans demanded surrender, General McAuliffe sent back one word: nuts. Days later, Patton's tanks broke through the snow and freed them. The Bulge collapsed. The Reich was finished, though it refused to admit it. Liberation and revelation. As the Allies advanced, they uncovered what words could barely contain. Behind barbed wire lay the evidence of industrialized murder camps named Auschwitz, Majdanek, Buchenwald. Skeletons in striped uniforms stared from behind fences. The camera lenses trembled. Humanity had looked into its own abyss. The omniscient narrator speaks softly. There are moments when history loses its voice. and only silence can testify. The meeting of fronts. In the east, the Red Army thundered toward Berlin. In the west, Allied troops crossed the Rhine. Bridges fell, then rose again on pontoons. The Third Reich shrank to its citadel of concrete and delusion. Hitler, hidden beneath the ruins, spoke to ghosts on radio waves that few still obeyed. Toward twilight. By spring 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. But within that ruin, seeds of peace waited fragile, green, persistent. Armies advanced with caution, knowing that the end of one nightmare would not mean the beginning of calm. On April 30th, as Soviet shells shattered the Reich Chancellery, Hitler took his own life. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered. On May 8th, Europe exhaled victory in Europe Day. Crowds wept and danced in the same breath. The bells rang again from London to Moscow, but their echo carried a question. What had humanity become to win this peace? Across the world, one war had ended. Another still raged. The Pacific was not yet silent. The omniscient voice lingers on a single thought. The continent sleeps, but the ocean still burns. The guns of Europe had quieted, but the war was not over. Across the oceans, the earth still shook, and the Pacific was a wound that refused to close. May 1945 had brought peace to half the world. The other half still bled. The Pacific Inferno. In the wake of Germany's surrender, America turned its full power eastward. The fleets that had crossed the Atlantic now filled the Pacific horizon. Islands that had once seemed specks on a map became stepping stones to destiny. Iwo Jima rose from the ocean like a scar. Its volcanic sand swallowed men whole. For 36 days, Marines clawed their way up Mount Suribachi. When the flag was raised against the smoke-filled sky, the image traveled faster than sound. It became the symbol of a generation's endurance. Okinawa followed, the bloodiest battle of them all. Kamikaze waves fell from the clouds like burning rain. Caves hid entire armies. Civilians leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. By June, the island was in American hands, but at a price so heavy that even victory felt hollow. Japan still refused to yield. The emperor remained silent. His generals swore to fight to the last breath. Allied planners studied the charts for an invasion of the home islands and saw only red casualty estimates in the millions. And so, behind locked laboratory doors, a new kind of weapon waited for its first test. The secret fire. In the deserts of New Mexico, scientists gathered before dawn on the 16th of July, 1945. They had spent years chasing a theory that could split the atom and with it, perhaps the conscience of mankind. When the light came, it turned night into day. The code name was Trinity. Those who witnessed it could not look away. One man whispered the words of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The omniscient narrator pauses. From the first spark of intelligence to this moment, humanity had never wielded so divine a power with so little understanding. The choice. President Truman faced the impossible: invade or unleash the atom. In August, the decision was made. August 6th, Hiroshima. A single plane, the Enola Gay, crossed the morning sky. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed forever. A sphere of light brighter than the sun erupted over the city. In an instant, 8,000 lives were erased. Shadows burned into walls. Rivers boiled. 3 days later came Nagasaki. Another flash. Another city turned to dust. Silence followed, an unnatural global silence. Then came surrender. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke by radio, his voice trembling through static. For the first time, his people heard him not as a god, but as a man. The war was over. The Reckoning. September 2nd, 1945. Aboard the battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the instrument of surrender. Around them lay the shattered remnants of fleets and dreams. General MacArthur spoke of peace, of a world reborn from ruin. Cameras clicked. Doves rose over the harbor. But beneath the ceremony lingered unease. 50 million dead, continents scarred, cities erased. The omniscient narrator whispers, "Victory has a taste of ash when the cost is beyond counting." The survivors. Across the globe, survivors stumbled from the rubble. In Europe, refugees wandered the roads, searching for homes that no longer existed. Children returned to villages where the bells no longer rang. The camps were liberated, but the word liberation could not cleanse what the eyes had seen. In Asia, prisoners of war emerged as skeletons. In China, entire provinces lay in famine. From the skies, locusts of peace relief aircraft descended with food and medicine. Yet hunger and disease claimed more lives than bullets had. The moral ruins. The victors turned from combat to judgment. Nuremberg, Tokyo. Wooden benches became witness stands. The crimes of nations were read aloud to the world. In those tribunals, humanity tried to place law above vengeance. For the first time, words like genocide and crimes against humanity entered the common tongue. The trials were imperfect, yet they marked a beginning, the attempt to hold power accountable. The omniscient voice remarks, "Justice, like peace, must be built in the ruins, or it will never stand." The new order. From the ashes, alliances took shape. The United Nations was born, its charter signed in the hope that dialogue could replace destruction. Across the Atlantic, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as twin giants, allies in victory, rivals in ideology. The Cold War's first breath fogged the glass of the New World. Europe, divided by occupation zones, braced for a peace as uneasy as any war. In the West, Marshall Plan cargo ships carried wheat and steel. In the East, the Red Army's shadow deepened. In Asia, independence movements flared. India's cry for freedom grew louder. Indonesia and Vietnam stirred. Empires that had ruled for centuries now trembled before the force of self-determination. The human cost. 10 hours of history could not measure what was lost in those 6 years. Cultures erased, families scattered, faith tested. The war had accelerated technology, medicine, and communication, but it had also revealed the abyss within progress itself. Hospitals filled with the faceless, hearts filled with questions. Could humanity learn restraint? Could memory become more than mourning? Survivors built monuments, wrote letters, had children. Life insisted on returning, stubborn and fragile. Epilogue of Fire. The narrator's voice softens until it is almost wind. From 1939 to 1945, the world waged a war not only of armies, but of ideas of tyranny against freedom, of despair against endurance. Out of that crucible came a new century, armed with wisdom and haunted by memory. The peace that followed was not the absence of conflict, but the promise that understanding might one day triumph over fear. And yet, somewhere in the human heart, the drums still echo. History never ends. It waits, patient as smoke, for the next generation to decide what kind of fire it will be. When the guns finally fell silent, the world did not rest. It began to hum. Engines, presses, forges. Everywhere. The tools that had built destruction turned toward rebuilding. But peace was not a pause. It was a new kind of struggle. One waged in laboratories, assembly lines, and the hearts of nations learning how to live again. The ghosts of industry. During the war, the factory had become a battlefield. Steel, oil, and circuitry were the new weapons, and science the new soldier. Radar, jet propulsion, synthetic rubber, penicillin, each born of necessity, each rewriting the limits of invention. Now those same discoveries spilled into civilian life. Radios became household companions. Antibiotics saved children who would once have been names on headstones. The omniscient narrator observes, the war taught mankind to dream in equations, and to fear what those dreams could build. Across the ruins of Europe, machines rolled again, this time laying tracks instead of tank treads. The Marshall Plan poured lifeblood into shattered economies. In West Germany, cranes rose above rubble like iron flowers. In Britain, ration cards lingered, but optimism glimmered through soot-streaked windows. The Iron Curtain descends, yet peace was already dividing. In 1946, from Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill spoke of an Iron Curtain, stretching from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Behind it, Stalin's empire consolidated its hold. Poland, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, each draped in red flags. The alliances of victory hardened into suspicion. The United States demobilized, but did not disarm. The Soviet Union rebuilt not just cities, but armies. In laboratories on both sides, the race for atomic supremacy began. The omniscient voice grows colder. The machines that had ended one tyranny were preparing to guard or destroy the next peace. This sumpit prove the new weapons. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The balance of terror was born. Engineers spoke of payloads, of yield, of megatons. Strategists coined new words: deterrence, mutually assured destruction. Skies once filled with bombers now glittered with rockets. Jet fighters screamed higher, faster. The war's children were learning to live beneath a permanent shadow. The human front. While nations armored themselves with ideology, people rebuilt from within. The displaced 12 million of them wandered across borders seeking a name, a home, a beginning. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration fed them, clothed them, asked them to believe in humanity again. In Nuremberg's aftermath, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights took form: 30 articles, meant to promise that never again would law bow to tyranny. Yet in the ruins of Hiroshima, survivors carried keloid scars as silent testimony to what those words still could not heal. Science without borders. Out of wartime laboratories came new marvels: computers the size of rooms, rocket engines reaching the edge of space. Scientists who had built weapons now spoke of satellites and medicine. The same mind that had split the atom dreamed of harnessing it for light. In the United States, the GI Bill sent millions to universities. In the Soviet Union, polytechnic institutes trained a new army of engineers. Knowledge became the next battlefield. The narrator muses, every discovery carries within it the ghost of the purpose for which it was born. A divided peace. In Asia, reconstruction took another form. Japan, under occupation, was remade its emperor a figurehead, its constitution reborn in the language of peace. Tokyo's ruins sprouted neon within a decade. In China, civil war resumed. By 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic. A fifth of humanity had changed its flag. Korea, sliced along the 38th parallel, simmered. In 1950, war returned north against south, communism against capitalism, ideology against ideology. The Second World War's embers had ignited the Cold War's first flame, the age of the machine. Automobiles filled streets where tanks had rolled. Television flickered into living rooms, turning war into memory and memory into spectacle. Factories that had built bombers now built refrigerators. Women who had riveted wings debated careers and rights. Modernity marched to the tempo of innovation. Yet even as prosperity bloomed, the planet bore scars. Radiation in soil, cities of widows, forests still littered with mines. Progress carried its own quiet grief. The shadow of memory. Monuments rose stone soldiers, eternal flames, museums of absence. But remembrance is selective. New generations looked at black and white footage and saw legend instead of loss. Veterans aged, their medals dulling with the years. The omniscient narrator reflects, history survives not in marble, but in the choices we make when no one watches. The true memorial to war is restraint. Prelude to tomorrow. By the mid-1950s, the world spun faster. The United States launched the first nuclear-powered submarine. The Soviets orbited Sputnik. Propaganda filled the airwaves, and schoolchildren ducked beneath desks that could not save them. Humanity had mastered the machine. Whether it had mastered itself remained uncertain. The narrator's voice softens. From the furnaces of total war emerged a species both brilliant and afraid. The machines of victory had remade the earth, but peace, fragile, invisible, still depended on the same old human heart. The war's thunder had faded, but its echo circled the globe. Empires that had marched victorious now found themselves trembling before a quieter revolution. The revolt of memory, of conscience, of peoples who had learned in fire what freedom truly meant. The reckoning of nations. In the ruins of Europe, collaborators were dragged before tribunals. In Asia, traitors stood beneath new flags. The thirst for justice was as fierce as the hunger that followed defeat. Yet vengeance has many disguises. Across the continent, women who had loved soldiers of the wrong uniform were shorn in public squares. Men who had hidden behind bureaucracy were confronted by the ghosts of those they had signed away. The omniscient voice murmurs, "War does not end when the last shot is fired. It ends when the living forgive themselves for surviving." Germany was carved in two, East and West, a scar that glowed on every map. In the East, cities rose under Soviet hammers. In the West, Marshall aid rebuilt skylines of glass and steel. Between them, the Berlin Wall would one day stand as monument and warning. The empire unravels. From Cairo to Calcutta, the old world cracked open. The colonies that had fed the empires through two wars now demanded their own dawn. In 1947, India awoke to independence. Crowds surged through Delhi streets, shouting joy and grief in equal measure. The partition line between India and Pakistan bled almost as soon as it was drawn. Millions displaced, thousands slain. Yet beneath the chaos, a truth long suppressed took breath. The age of empire was dying. In Burma, Indonesia, and Vietnam, flags of rebellion unfurled. In Africa, students and soldiers whispered of self-rule. The omniscient narrator observes, every empire writes its epitaph in the languages it once forbade. The cold front of peace. While old empires fractured, two new giants loomed. Washington and Moscow measured their strength not in armies, but in influence aid, ideology, orbiting satellites. Europe divided along invisible lines of loyalty. NATO formed in 1949. The Warsaw Pact followed. Iron met iron without clash, a frozen standoff that came to be called peace. The Korean Peninsula became its first battlefield. In June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. Seoul fell, the United Nations responded. American Marines landed at Incheon, and the tide reversed. Chinese divisions flooded south, and the tide reversed again. 3 years later, an armistice left everything unchanged but the graves. Science and shadows. The atomic age quickened. In Nevada and Kazakhstan, mushroom clouds blossomed like obscene flowers. Each detonation was both triumph and terror. Civil defense films instructed children how to survive the unsurvivable. Yet out of fear came wonder. In 1953, Watson and Crick mapped the double helix, a new code of life, to mirror the code of death mankind had already mastered. The transistor shrank machines to the size of hands. The dreams of peace were now powered by the engines of war. Culture in the crossfire. The 1950 seconds became an age of contrast. Conformity and rebellion, jazz and jet engines, ration books and rock and roll. Cinema rediscovered heroism, sometimes truthfully, sometimes not. Veterans watched their nightmares turn to technicolor. Artists painted abstract anguish. Writers coined new words for old fears, existentialism, nuclear anxiety. The omniscient voice reflects, every generation rebuilds the world in the image of its own scars. The resistance of memory. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, whispers persisted under the boot of ideology. Churches rang their bells softly. Poets wrote in metaphor. Students printed manifestos by candlelight. In 1956, Budapest rose against its occupiers and was drowned in blood. But even crushed rebellions leave seeds. Across the Iron Curtain, the West watched and debated freedom as spectacle. Refugees slipped through barbed wire into Austria. Their stories reached radios that governments could not silence. Revenge and reckoning. Meanwhile, old hunters sought old prey. Nazi war criminals were tracked across continents, in Argentina, in Syria, in shadows. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, 1961, placed the machinery of genocide under the world's gaze. Survivors testified, and language itself strained to contain their words. Israel was born from that same history, a nation forged from exile and memory. Its survival would open new chapters of conflict that still smolder in the deserts of faith and geography. The Earth rearmed. The late 1950 seconds brought new frontiers. Sputnik orbited the planet, a metallic heartbeat above the clouds. America answered with Explorer, with NASA, with a promise to reach the moon. Space became the newest theater of rivalry, its silence echoing the same ambitions that had once driven men across trenches and oceans. The narrator remarks, mankind lifted its eyes to the heavens, but its feet were still in the ashes, endings that are beginnings. By the dawn of the 1960 seconds, the children of war had grown. They marched for civil rights, for peace, for purpose. They built universities on former battlefields and wrote symphonies out of sirens. The generation that had survived inherited a mission not to repeat. The omniscient voice softens. The resistance of one century becomes the conscience of the next. The world was still divided, but alive its people stubbornly, beautifully human. The middle decades of the 20th century were not a peace. They were an aftershock. Across the continents, the great powers of yesterday staggered, and new nations were born screaming into the light. Flags changed, borders bled, and the vocabulary of history itself shifted from conquest to independence, from empire to identity. The winds of freedom. The 1960 seconds arrived like a sunrise after centuries of night. In Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the language of power was rewritten in native tongues. Ghana's independence in 1957 sounded the first clear trumpet. Within 10 years, more than 30 African states followed. Each flag raised was both celebration and warning. Freedom without stability is another form of war. Colonial capitals watched their maps fade. London, Paris, Brussels, Lisbon, cities that had once ruled oceans now ruled only memory. The omniscient voice intones, empires do not die when their armies retreat. They die when the conquered no longer dream in their conqueror's language. The fracture of faiths. The Middle East, carved by foreign pens after the Great War, became a crossroads of consequence once more. The birth of Israel and the flight of Palestinians marked the region with a wound still open. Egypt's Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France struck back and were humiliated. The United States and the Soviet Union discovered that oil and ideology could burn with equal heat. The Cold War had found its most volatile mirror, not Europe, but the deserts and deltas where faith and frontier intertwined. The superpowers ascendant. While old empires crumbled, two new ones, neither colonial in name but imperial in reach, stared across the world. America wrapped its influence in movies and markets, the Soviet Union in manifestos and missiles. Berlin became the symbol of division made stone. The wall rose overnight in 1961, slicing streets, families, and futures. In Cuba, Revolution toppled a dictator and welcomed another. When Soviet missiles were discovered there in 1962, the planet came within a breath of annihilation. 13 days of brinkmanship, 13 nights when children slept under kitchen tables. Then, silence. The ships turned back, the missiles removed. Humanity had looked into the abyss and blinked. The people's revolutions. In the streets of Paris, Prague, and Saigon, youth marched beneath banners of peace and rebellion. The generation born after the war rejected its father's certainties. Rock music replaced anthems. Poetry replaced propaganda. The omniscient narrator observes, "Every peace breeds its own revolt, for freedom is a hunger that cannot be rationed." In the United States, the struggle for civil rights turned internal eyes toward justice long deferred. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood beneath the marble gaze of Lincoln and declared a dream that echoed beyond race, beyond nation, the dream of conscience over conformity. Vietnam, the war that wouldn't end. Yet while voices sang of peace, helicopters thundered over rice paddies. Vietnam became the crucible of a new kind of conflict, televised, politicized, and endless. Napalm lit jungles. Body counts replaced victory. The lessons of World War II technology, total commitment, industrial might were repeated without its clarity of cause. When Saigon finally fell in 1975, the images were eerily familiar. Refugees clinging to aircraft, cities burning, ideologies collapsing under their own weight. Africa and the New World Order. In Africa, independence brought both renaissance and reckoning. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, the Congo, names once footnotes in colonial ledgers, now stood at the podiums of the United Nations. But power left a vacuum, and into it poured greed, tribal rivalry, and foreign manipulation. Dictators rose wrapped in flags of liberation. Still, amid the turbulence, a cultural awakening bloomed: literature, music, and art proclaiming, "We are here." The drums of identity replaced the drums of empire. The fall of illusions. By the late 1972, even the superpowers felt fatigue. The Soviet Union, stretched from Berlin to Kabul, began to crack under its own gravity. In America, the dream of boundless progress dimmed amid scandal and inflation. Yet out of weariness came wisdom, treaties, exchanges, the first tentative steps toward détente. Apollo 11 had placed footprints on the moon. Mankind had reached the heavens, only to find its reflection waiting there. The narrator's voice softens. Conquest, it seemed, had nowhere left to go but inward. The cultural reckoning. The arts became confessionals for a century's sins. Filmmakers turned their lenses on genocide and guilt. Writers chronicled survival and silence. In Germany, memorials replaced monuments. In Japan, paper cranes replaced propaganda. The memory of World War II no longer glorified it, cautioned. Television carried those memories into every home. The Holocaust was no longer rumor but image. Hiroshima no longer statistic but story. The children of peace grew up haunted by a war they never fought. The economic empire. While ideologies sparred, commerce quietly conquered. Europe, once divided by barbed wire, began to unite through trade, the coal and steel community, then the common market. The dollar replaced the battleship as the measure of might. Corporations spanned continents. Information traveled faster than diplomacy. For the first time in human history, power could be exercised by supply chain rather than sword. The shadow of tomorrow. By the end of the 1970s, dictators fell, ideologies wavered, and satellites circled an increasingly fragile planet. The Cold War remained, but its edges dulled. Beneath it all, a single truth persisted. The 20th century was the child of two wars that had taught humanity both creation and destruction. The omniscient voice, quiet now, says, "Empires fall not in battles, but in hearts. When belief falters, no army can stand." The age that began in trenches and ashes was giving birth to a new era, one of computers, communication, and uncertainty. The torch of power passed again, and the world inhaled before the next storm. The 20th century neared its twilight beneath a sky filled with eyes. Satellites drifted like patient ghosts, each one a silent witness to the balance of terror. No front lines, no trenches, only the invisible mathematics of destruction waiting in orbit. The Age of Fear. By the early 1980 seconds, the Cold War had hardened into ritual. Submarines prowled beneath the Arctic ice, missile silos slept in Midwestern fields, and entire cities rehearsed for the end of the world. Sirens replaced sermons. School children learned to duck and cover beneath the symbol of the atom. The omniscient voice speaks. When every nation holds the power of apocalypse, diplomacy becomes a prayer. The arms race devoured wealth and reason alike. Each advance in guidance systems or payloads promised safety through superiority, and instead delivered paranoia. Humanity lived one miscalculation away from extinction. The fire that never fell. In 1962, the world had trembled. In 1983, it nearly ceased. A Soviet early warning satellite reported incoming American missiles. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov looked at the blips on his screen and chose not to believe them. He refused to retaliate. The blips vanished, false alarms. One man's hesitation saved the planet. History is not only shaped by heroes who act, the narrator whispers, but by those who refuse to. The cracks in the iron. While the superpowers glared, their foundations began to crumble. In Eastern Europe, dissent moved like underground water. Polish dockworkers formed solidarity. Poets in Prague wrote truth in riddles. Church bells replaced gunfire. Inside the Kremlin, a new word surfaced: glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. Mikhail Gorbachev, rising from within the old machinery, dared to speak reform aloud. The Soviet monolith, built on fear, began to question itself. The wars of the proxy. Elsewhere, the Cold War still burned hot. Afghanistan became the graveyard of ambition. Soviet helicopters scoured mountain valleys, while Mujahideen fighters struck from caves that once sheltered empires past. American missiles armed the rebels. The echoes of that alliance would linger far beyond the decade. In Africa and Latin America, revolutions and coups flickered under the same global shadow. Ideology wore local masks: Marxist, nationalist, liberationist. But behind each was the same contest for influence between East and West. Technology and transformation. As politicians argued, engineers built the future. Silicon chips replaced vacuum tubes. The personal computer blinked awake on desks, from California to Moscow. The same minds that had once designed bomb trajectories now mapped digital networks. Information was becoming the new weapon, and truth the new battlefield. Television carried not only propaganda but empathy. Images of famine in Ethiopia and protests in Beijing traveled the globe faster than any bullet. Humanity could no longer claim ignorance, only indifference. Chernobyl, the 26th of April 1986. In the Ukrainian night, reactor number 4 exploded. A pillar of light rose into the darkness, a man-made aurora of poison. Firefighters rushed in, unaware that they were entering legend. Villages emptied, fields died, maps were redrawn in invisible ink. Chernobyl became the monument of an age that trusted machines more than wisdom. The fire from the sky, the narrator intones, was not war's final weapon, but peace's warning. Walls and whispers. By the late 1980 seconds, the whisper had become a roar. In Poland, elections unseated communists. In Hungary, barbed wire was cut. On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall cracked beneath hammers and songs. East met West in the rubble of ideology. Tears tasted of dust and disbelief. Across Europe, statues toppled without shots. The Iron Curtain dissolved into applause. The empire that undid itself. 2 years later, the Soviet Union, that vast engine of fear and faith, dissolved. On Christmas Day 1991, the red flag lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War ended not in victory or defeat, but in exhaustion. The nuclear arsenals remained, but the purpose had evaporated. The omniscient voice breathes. Great powers die the way stars do, not with explosions, but with silence after burning too long. A new disorder, the 1990 seconds, began not with peace, but with confusion. Yugoslavia, once a proud federation, tore itself apart in ethnic fury. Sarajevo burned under sniper fire. Genocide returned to Europe's doorstep. The United Nations, born to prevent such horror, watched in bureaucratic paralysis. In the Persian Gulf, coalition armies expelled Iraq from Kuwait, proving that technology could win wars in days, but not solve the politics that follow. Globalization promised unity through trade, yet inequality deepened. The Cold War had ended. The human condition had not. Echoes of the past. Holocaust museums opened their doors. Veterans told their stories before memory could fade. New generations traced their lineage through archives and ruins. The internet linked the planet, making history immediate, inescapable. But the same networks carried hate as swiftly as knowledge. The narrator warns, information without wisdom is merely noise, and noise, too, can destroy. The threshold of the present. As the century turned, the world seemed both closer and more divided than ever before. The promises of progress walked beside the shadows of old hatred. Planes crossed oceans in hours, missiles in minutes. The war that had ended in 1945 had not vanished. It had evolved into vigilance, into memory, into the systems that still govern fear. The guns are silent now. The smoke of 100 battlefields has long since faded into the sky. Yet the echoes remain not in sound, but in memory, in story, in the restless pulse of a century that can never quite sleep. The century that remembered. The Second World War ended in 1945, but it never truly ended. It lived on in textbooks, in monuments, in the eyes of those who survived. It reshaped borders, languages, and the architecture of belief. Every treaty written after it, every alliance signed, carried its watermark. The omniscient narrator's voice settles into calm. The world that emerged from the ashes built its future on remembrance, because forgetting is the first step toward repetition. Children studied maps that had once been secret. Veterans told stories to grandchildren who could not imagine the noise. The 20th century learned to call itself modern, yet its foundations were ancient fear, ambition, hope. The legacy of power. Nuclear weapons still sleep in silos, their guardians older, their codes renewed with each generation. They are relics of a faith in deterrence, in the idea that terror can preserve peace. The narrator sighs. Humanity has learned how not to fight, but not yet why. The superpowers became partners and competitors, in economics, in exploration, in the race to understand the planet they nearly destroyed. Satellites charted forests, oceans, clouds, a cartography of survival. The war had taught mankind how fragile the world truly was, and how infinite its capacity to repair. The heirs of the dead. Every nation carries ghosts. In Germany, they are confronted daily, memorialized in bronze and silence. In Japan, the paper cranes of Hiroshima flutter still in the wind. In Russia, the graves of 20 million soldiers stretch beyond sight. In America, white crosses gleam on French soil, where boys who never saw 30 sleep beneath the same sky they freed. Time has softened none of it. The omniscient voice observes. There is no such thing as an old war, only wars that have stopped being spoken aloud. And then, the lessons written in stone. Museums of genocide, of occupation, of liberation stand as classrooms for conscience. Each generation interprets them anew, some with reverence, some with fatigue. History competes with convenience, yet refuses to vanish. Artists paint in ashes. Filmmakers reconstruct ruins, frame by frame. The language of remembrance expands poetry, sound, virtual simulation, yet all strive toward the same impossible goal: to understand how humanity could both destroy and redeem itself in the same century. The new century's mirror. When the new millennium arrived, fireworks lit the same skies once filled with searchlights. The world declared progress, but the echoes of war threaded through it still. The Balkan conflicts, the deserts of the Middle East, the jungles of Africa, each whispered that peace is a verb, not a noun. In September 2001, towers fell, and the smoke over Manhattan resembled the photographs of London, Warsaw, Tokyo. Once again, civilians were targets. Once again, grief sought meaning. The war on terror became the new global struggle, fought with drones instead of divisions, with surveillance instead of spies. The omniscient voice reflects. The century that promised never again keeps finding new reasons to remember why it promised. The human thread. And yet, amid every relapse into violence, the thread of empathy endures. Soldiers of once enemy nations train together. Students study the languages of former foes. The European Union, born from coal and steel, grows from the idea that trade is cheaper than blood. Humanitarian organizations cross borders faster than armies. Each generation adds a verse to the same unfinished poem. The refusal to accept inevitability. The witnesses fading. The last veterans are old now. Their hands shake when they salute. Their medals, once bright, have tarnished into quiet metal. They are the final witnesses to the war that defined an age. With each passing year, their stories become recordings, then transcripts, then memories held by strangers. The narrator's tone turns gentle. When the witnesses are gone, remembrance becomes duty. Across cemeteries, students place flowers they never saw bloom. Digital archives hum where once drums marched. The world continues, forgetful and grateful in equal measure. The balance of hope. Technology, born of conflict, now peers beyond the solar system. Probes drift where once bombers flew. The same ingenuity that forged weapons now deciphers genomes, repairs hearts, maps galaxies. Progress, for all its flaws, is a kind of penance. The omniscient voice lifts. Every invention is an echo of survival. We build because we remember what it meant to destroy. Epilogue. The voice of history. And so the war that reshaped the world continues to shape it, still not through armies, but through the memory of consequence. The narrator's final words. History is not past, it is present, whispered in every negotiation, every border, every act of mercy. The Second World War ended on paper, but it lives on in the choices we make each day. May those choices honor the fallen by ensuring there are no more heroes made by necessity. May the world, at last, learn the simplest lesson written in its own ruins, that peace, like freedom, must be defended not with guns, but with understanding. End of the Chronicle. The world turns still. The oceans are quiet. The skies full of satellites and stars. Somewhere, a child opens a history book and finds the same faces, the same questions, the same hope that when the next storm comes, we will remember what the last one cost.